You're listening to the AI Ophthalmology Marketing Podcast, Lab Talk. In this episode, we unpack a question most practice owners never stop to ask: who actually owns your retirement? Through 3 real-world scenarios, independent practice, private equity, and corporate acquisition, we reveal how the same $2 million on paper can tell completely different stories depending on who's in control. From missed succession plans to the hidden trade-offs of private equity and the surprise rise of corporate buyers reshaping the entire landscape, this conversation challenges everything you thought you knew about building and cashing in on your practice. If you've ever assumed your practice equals your future, this episode may change how you see it forever. So, Becky, I said something to you a few weeks ago. I think I was complaining about something, I don't know, and you got very quiet and you said, wait, say that again. And that's how this episode started.
Yeah, that's true. When you made this comment, I immediately thought I didn't know anything about that. And it's so much bigger than what I was thinking the situation was. We were talking about private equity, but I was always thinking of it as like a financial thing. And your comment was, well, my practice is my retirement. So I started researching, what does that retirement look like when PE's in the picture? And that kind of took me off on a journey of understanding there's much more there than I thought.
Yeah. And so when you started mentioning that, and of course, what we're mostly talking about here is independent practices, specifically AI augmented marketing. And I'm like, well, what does that have to do with all of this? But as you'll see, those of you listening, this kind of all folds in together. So we're going to start off by saying neither one of us is a private equity lawyer or merger and acquisition advisor. But if you'll give us a little bit of a leash here, we'll tell you what Becky really researched, and it's interesting how it all falls together. It was kind of surprising to me. There were some things I didn't really know about this. So what we're going to do is frame this as a thought experiment, let's say. So one ophthalmologist and 3 scenarios, and the same ophthalmologist, 20, 25 years in practice, and the equity stake in their practice, let's say $2 million on the books. And in every one of these scenarios, the money's still in the balance sheet. But the question we're going to track across all 3, the question we keep coming back to is who actually owns the process for turning that $2 million into a retirement. And so that's where the title came from, who owns your retirement. And I mean that literally, because the answer is not always what you would think. So the first scenario is one most of you know pretty well, but the way things change with each new scenario may be surprising. So where is an ophthalmologist's retirement money actually? We all have probably an IRA, maybe a 401k, but the practice equity really should be the main retirement plan.
Right. And just to echo what Peter just said, a total disclaimer, this is not legal advice. This is not financial advice. This is our research and our subjective interpretation of what we found. But we thought it's still worth sharing, so we will. So the question that I wanted to pursue was, what happens if someone else controls the fate of the practice, besides an independent practice that we always are the champions of? So my question began around the idea that your retirement, Peter, is your percent of the practice. How common is it versus like a normal employee with a 401k and retirement stuff, and they work for a salary, and maybe if, who they work for is public, they can also share in the company growth by buying shares.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously everyone's going to be in a different situation. And if you are smart enough to start putting a little money aside when you're working as a resident or whatever, you may have an IRA. If you get good financial advice, maybe you'll have some sort of a 401k when you're in private practice. But, really the equity you build in the practice over 20 or 30 years, that's really what you're hoping to have as a retirement. So when you're ready to retire, you sell. That's the plan. Of course, then the question is, who are you selling to? But that's kind of where this started.
Yeah, this is where my field of vision on this widened because I was only looking at private equity as a kind of a business strategy, efficiency, scale, access to capital, competitive abilities, and stuff like that. I wasn't really looking at it as a retirement story for the partners. The dots that got connected is that, in my mind anyway, the consolidation wave that also now has become partially a retirement story. And so, what are the implications of that? And I came back to you with some of the things I found, and it seemed to me they were a little disturbing.
Yeah, and I agree with you as far as the disturbing part. So when I look at my situation, and then physicians that I've known, again, if you're in private practice, the practice is the asset, and you build it, you sell it, and you retire. That's not necessarily common knowledge outside of medical practices. But apart from going into medicine because it's a calling or what have you, it has to be a business too. And so you have to think, what is it going to look like when I retire?
Okay, so the first thing I looked at was just, I guess, the baseline case or the one that I know because I know you, which is an independent practice. The doctor and their partners build it themselves, they still own all of it. And on paper, let's say in our scenario, the doctor's stake in the practice is about $2 million, and that's the retirement. But what if there's no plan for exactly what happens when they're ready to divest, I guess is the best way to say it, but they're ready to stop practicing and then realize all of the gains that they've accumulated over the years. And so
And by the way, in case if someone listening may say, well, that doesn't happen. I'm thinking about it. You'd be surprised, people who haven't really thought about that. And then they find themselves just pulling the blind down, locking the door, and just walking away.
so is it true then that if they don't have, I guess it's a succession plan, I would call it a buyout plan or something, because the word succession to me means who is the leader, who's the new CEO or something. But anyway, the practice was built to keep them working, not to retire them really. It's meant to employ them fully, and then their reward is at the end, if that's a good way of saying it. But what really happens, I can't imagine some younger doctor comes in where all the partners have been there 10, 20 years, would have the wherewithal to buy out any one of them.
Yeah, there's different ways that can be structured. And again, if you're in a group, in my case, the practice is 50 plus years old. So we've got the history and we've kind of developed a process to do it through trial and error. But if someone's out there saying, well, I'm starting a practice or I just joined a practice that has another doctor or two, they maybe hadn't thought about that. So, yeah, there's ways to do it, there's ways not to do it. So, we're going to talk a little bit about that and also some other scenarios. But this is something that you didn't learn in residency. And unless you're in a situation where you can learn from partners that are retiring, you may be in a situation that you don't want to be in.
So basically, the plan to convert it to cash might be missing or partially done. It's not always something that everybody thinks of then.
No, no, for sure. And again, if someone's listening saying, well, how could that happen? It happens all the time. I mean, I've got colleagues who, for example, were in a group, they were all the same age. They really didn't think about this. Retirement is many years in the future. And then things happen and the group ends up splitting up. They didn't really have a plan. They had a new building, so they had to get rid of that. And then you end up with 5 people in solo practice and still with no plan. And that's the scenario where, if you're lucky that you had your own office duplex or something that you purchased, someone will buy that, but no one's buying your practice. There's value in that, but you lost that because there was no plan.
So in this case, the practice owns the retirement, and yet it didn't work out the way it was expected.
Yes, because in the end, you didn't have a buyer.
So that scenario that we're talking about, the practice owned the retirement, but what if something changes about who owns it? That was my next sort of breadcrumb here. My question: what does that mean for an individual partner's expectations if the practice doesn't own it? And so that framework,
So yeah,
that
yeah,
scenario,
right.
we know who owns your retirement when it's the independent practice. The practice does, even if the expectation of it being easy to do it when you're ready to retire to get the money out you were expecting, that might have a hiccup or two because of the lack of planning within the partnership itself. But that is, if the practice owns your retirement, that's fine. But then what I began to think of was, if the practice doesn't own your retirement, as in private equity, then what does that mean for your expectations about retirement that you're thinking you will get? And so I did a little bit of work thinking along those lines. And that scenario two, I have called seemed like a good idea at the time. What do partners actually sign up for? And then what has changed in the private equity landscape, specifically about what in the early days, it was the go-go years of private equity and look, things looked great. And then something doesn't look so great now. There's more and more stories about partners buying practices back or private equity debt loads just exploding, or so why didn't it work? And my research led me to believe that, you can tell me more, but in the 90s, things looked pretty good, right?
Well, I'll give you a quick story on this. I remember someone in my residency, they were actually like a year ahead of me, that did a fellowship and then went and joined a pretty reputable practice in the Midwest. And not long after, they sold to private equity. And I didn't even know what that was at the time. I mean, this was in the 90s, you know? This is like the first wave. It was one of the big players. And he wasn't super happy about it because this really benefited the older partners more. I didn't really think about it too much after that. But apparently, not long after that, they actually bought the practice back. So I don't know what happened. I never did talk to him about it. But this is when things were starting. And there was a big, much ado about that. And then it kind of fizzled and didn't hear much about it. And now we've got this second wave. But it was always about getting a big check, and that was multiples of revenue. And maybe you had to stay on for a few years after that. But there was a lot of that happening. And we see that in recent years happening again. And I think there's a lot of that fear of missing out. Everybody's doing it. You better hurry up and do it while the deals are good. You can practice a little more. You got that nice check. But I think there was not a lot of thought about what happens down the road. So that's my experience with it.
Okay, so you've got a bigger slice of a smaller pie, or you've got a smaller slice of a bigger pie, is what that is.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you don't have any equity in your practice because your practice is owned by someone else. So you have equity in the new entity, and then that may change the color of your retirement picture as well.
Sure.
So give
Yeah.
me some sense of the shift in terms of what we've been talking about, this shift in terms of retirement, and your equity was always worth 2 million. No, it's still 2 million on the books. The number hasn't changed at all, has it? No, don't you think?
Yeah. I mean, that's what they say. And you get some of that up front. But I think a lot of doctors have said there's not a lot of transparency about exactly how that works. Now, maybe in this second wave, you've got more advisors making sure that no one's taking advantage of or whatever, but it still is, you get the check up front and then the rest is rolled into equity. Now, instead of equity in the practice, it's equity of the private equity owned platform is what they call it. But, what you end up having is doctors spending not an insignificant amount of their time calling other doctors to get them to join because they're trying to build the pie bigger. So the bigger it gets, then the bigger their stake, or supposedly that's how it is. So it made sense because the model was designed for a specific set of financial conditions, but like all things, those are subject to change.
Okay, so the financial conditions of your retirement would change as well. And there's an old phrase that it's not a party till something breaks. And the PE roll ups are certainly a party then, when you think about it. The debt they took on to buy the practice is other people's money. And so they could buy that money for practically nothing. And now, with the cost of financing going up and the inability to do anything but mainly service debt, the model looks like it might be breaking, and that might break the rosy picture for the retirement destiny that partners thought they had.
And this is the part that when you found out about this and told me about it, I had no idea this was going on. So this kind of is our third scenario, or working up towards it, I guess, is that the rates go up and then the debt becomes an issue. And so now these entities have to figure out how to pay that. So it's got to come from somewhere. And like a lot of things, it's going to come from the doctor's pocket. So now there's nothing left for equipment upgrades or retaining staff or the supposed growth that they needed to get that multiple. So the 2 million still on the balance sheet, but now it seems like it's more out of reach. What started happening then? Explain what started happening now to these entities.
Well, realistically, it's happening now. I don't think it's endemic necessarily, but research revealed more and more stories of the partners buying back their own practice, some with significant upside for doing it, and some walked away rather than buy it back and just practice medicine without the framework of the practice that they had. But they really were making a business decision that they thought would pay off, even though the clinical side of everything didn't really change, did it? I mean, the fact that they couldn't attract talented partners because the offers weren't that sizzling to new people joining, or the fact that staff couldn't be retrained, or because equipment couldn't be acquired like it used to be. And also just the layers of deciding was there. So the people in the private equity model had something that might look good on paper, but the end in sight didn't really look that great once you began looking at all of the things that would have to be done, the plates that would have to keep spinning.
So we started seeing cracks in some of these practices, some of which are our competitors. Partners were leaving or they were fired, escorted out the door, take their keys away, employees leaving and coming to work for us, patients leaving, in some cases in the middle of having their cataracts done, one eye's done, and they didn't stay to have the other one done. So we knew that something was going on.
Okay, so the scenario two, then, let's say PE firm has to pay back the investors, they need out. Who buys this portfolio? But the bigger question is, what happens next then to their retirement? So the PE firm may be trapped servicing debt because they have to pay back their own investors and the debt is being paid by the practice. So is it a distressed portfolio? Probably. But what happens with the retirement for the doctors, the cash inside a private equity purchase that isn't going swimmingly? Well, this is where visibility and control really don't exist. You aren't part of the decision making process about what to do with the asset. So that scenario is a little bit more troubling than just not having planned adequately. The final scenario was one I think you didn't even know about, right?
No, I didn't. No. Did
This
not.
one I call there's a new sheriff in town. Who is buying from private equity? Now, I'm not talking about distress. The purchases that I'm thinking about here are the corporate, what were they? Corporate strategists?
Corporate strategics.
Corporate strategics, yes.
Yeah.
And so a Fortune 10 or 11 pharmaceutical distributor, you know of McKesson. In this scenario, I'll just stay with them because everybody kind of knows who they are. And they bought a giant portfolio. It was like 90 practices, 200
Wow.
doctors. And so these were assets within one entity transferred en masse to a whole nother corporate level. The doctors didn't pick the buyer, McKesson, the private equity firm did. And so
Wow.
remember, they weren't holding a fire sale. They were selling what McKesson thought and believed to be true, a growth engine. And so this was a distributor, massive, I think $308 billion
Yeah.
company.
Big.
Yeah. So they were still seeing money here. And the picture that they saw that I didn't realize they saw is pretty open to me, to your interpretation as well. But these weren't like a financial play, buy it, flip it, pay off the investors, take your money and run. This was a long term play, but it wasn't a play that the doctors could have any say in. Nobody called the doctors, the partners in each practice, and say, how about it? Nobody even called the practice as an entity because it was all in the portfolio. So
Mm.
these individuals' retirement accounts were also swept up because their right to exist depended on who owns them, I'm sure. So nobody chose McKesson, and McKesson didn't choose the partners. They chose the lump, the whole stack. And
Gee.
the reason about buying them opened a question that I think this was the other part of it, which was what was the driving force to make the purchase?
Yeah. And again, this is not something I was even aware of. And I hesitate to think that a lot of the physicians, as you just alluded to, that are involved probably weren't sure either. I mean, maybe they got a letter say, hey, this is happening. You don't really have a decision now. You're an asset that's getting sold along with a bunch of other practices. And so now the retirement vehicle that they may have had as an independent practice and maybe still had to some degree as part of the private equity. Well, now they are just a cog in this corporate machine. So now what does that supposed $2 million on the books even look like at this point?
Well, yeah, and remember their stock isn't in their own practice anymore. It was in the Prism Group
It's not
because
even
Prism
McKesson stock.
no, it's not even McKesson stock either. And so Prism owned 80% of the practices, and I think, or maybe 100%, I don't know, but McKesson bought 80% of Prism, and now they're a subsidiary of McKesson, as I understand.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so the physicians who sold out to private equity, they did make a conscious decision to not remain independent. But
Right.
after that, they got swept up with the tide, I guess is the best way to say it.
So what happens to their employment contracts?
Well, we don't really know. The things I found in the research seem to imply that they would not immediately vaporize or anything, but over the course of maybe a year, the terms would be renegotiated. I would assume that the conditions for non-compete might be really tight, as even if they were tight before, they might really be tight. And, there's just no visibility into actual data on what that might be. But this is just sort of factoring out what is likely to work in the favor of the acquirer, which would be to corral everything and control as much as you can.
And probably at the bottom of their list is who owns the doctors at retirement at that point.
Yeah, this is the part that is completely, we don't know details on it. We're not assuming that we do, but it just seems that as the layers build in terms of who owns what and what they do about it, even though the number on the screen might still say $2 million, the access to that has maybe completely changed. And even the actual amount that in the end is obtainable and the conditions under which it is might have completely changed yet again.
And so the thing that kind of struck a chord with me was that a lot of people are familiar with private equity. And I mean, it's always in the news, these merger and acquisition, you pump and dump, you buy a company, you squeeze everything you can, and then you unload it or something. And it's probably not exactly what's happening with private equity with ophthalmology practices, but it is sort of just a vehicle for them to make money on the back end. But now these corporate buyers are a different animal, and they're not doing that. They're keeping these things. And so I think that kind of piqued your interest. Like, okay, why is this their model? How do they look at these practices? And that's the thing that was very interesting.
Yeah, I think our way of looking at it, or the question that really gnawed at me was, well, what do they actually want? And what does it cost the physicians inside to give it to them?
Mm.
Because now there's another upside than just a financial transaction with a sell. They're not going to sell. And so we gave cash for the thing. We didn't finance the purchase of the private equity portfolio. And so you, the doctor, are not just their employee, but you're also their customer, and a captive one at that, because the corporate strategics are operationally different than the private equity firms that we're buying. So what might you be giving up that you don't realize you're giving up? Well, in 2 words, I think it's vertical integration. The motive was before, when they sold to the practice, they sold surgical kits and pharmaceuticals and things like that, and they made money on the sale. But there was evidently, and some of this may work out to be very provable, but these are just hints that we have right now. They make money on more than just the supplies they sell, because there's a whole value chain. And so this is the thing they bought.
Yeah. And like I said, that was pretty eye opening for me because you go from being a partner in a practice to being a sort of a partner in the private equity entity. And now you are kind of like an asset. You said they're paying cash for this. If someone's paying cash for something, it's probably worth a lot.
Yeah, I
That
mean,
was pretty
think
interesting.
about it. Before, they got one kind of revenue, which is margin on what they sell on the distribution margin. But now, because they own it, they're making money on the procedure and on the reimbursement. So every patient is 3 revenue events.
Oh,
And so they work for the owner and they buy from the owner. Now, not totally exclusively, but you're basically a captive customer for anything that your owner might be able to sell you.
yeah. And so before the acquisition, you could make decisions based on what was clinically best or what you decided was best for your patient. And if a better intraocular lens came out, you could switch. If another company offered better pricing, you could negotiate, you had leverage. But after this acquisition, that leverage is gone. As you said, the owner is the supplier. So they're telling you what to buy at that point. One of the reasons we go into medicine is to be your own boss. You have still some autonomy there. But here, you've really lost that autonomy. When you say we don't know what happens with these employment contracts, but I'm sure those will be renegotiated and they'll probably be a little bit tighter as far as the compensation structure and the non-compete. And now you're dealing with a mega company that has a huge legal department and they'll probably enforce things in a way that the private equity employer either wouldn't or couldn't.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, it sounds like stability and resources and permanence, some longer term vision than next quarter, things like that. But the other part that we haven't put a value on is the data that surrounds the information of the practice doing medicine, the actual data in terms of predictive modeling or behavioral economics for marketing, the access to the data stores about how patients buy things
That's huge.
is not in the invoices between a practice and a supplier. The way that the practice captures the buyer's behavior in terms of its marketing, the tracking that they can do, the attribution is the $5 word for it. So all of those data now become open to being used in service to selling more things.
Mm, yeah.
So
Yeah. That's a,
now you're still looking at your $2 million, but the corporate machine was never meant to sell your practice at a profit and give you the money from those proceeds. Now, this corporate machine doesn't have any intention of selling the practice.
yeah. That $2 million on the balance sheet is getting fuzzier and fuzzier.
Yeah, often the question is, should we sell? And that may be a true but misleading question. Should we sell is a good question. But the question might never be, should I sell? But why would I give this up? The practice is the asset. It always was. And I think you know that truly, deeply, madly, that the practice is the asset. But asking, should I sell and not why would I give this up, completely reframes your thinking to an extent, doesn't it?
Right. And exactly for the reason that if someone's willing to pay so much money cash for something, they're not stupid. I mean, they probably have a good reason to it. So we title this Who Owns Your Retirement? But really, we should probably be saying who should own your retirement. And for a long time, we've been saying, like I mentioned earlier, private equity is coming and jump on the train before it's too late. But now corporate strategics are coming. And so everyone's feeling like they have to choose. What do I do? Now, of course, you don't really have a choice with it when the corporates come along, but practices are being asked, when do you sell and to whom? But maybe this puts a different spin on it. If someone's willing to pay so much, maybe we need to be asking ourselves a different question.
Well, yeah, I think that this revealed that maybe these guys truly understand how valuable the practice is or the practices are, since
Even
they
if
don't buy
the doctors
individual
don't.
practice. And the doctors may
Yeah.
not be aware of just how truly valuable it might be. And the private equity has a whole different driver for wanting to cut a deal. So this is the context of independent medicine, back to what we always are weaving into any of these talks is the practice independently now has a new, I guess, a new aspect that I never thought we'd really talk about because we're not financial guys, we're not lawyers or anything about M&A or all of that. But because I'm your friend and I thought about your own retirement and how this would strike with you, do they know something that you might not know? And have you ever thought about it? And does it make sense that this could be true?
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, it was very eye-opening. I mean, didn't really know the aspect of these private equities being sort of rolled into these larger entities. And then again, paying cash. And that, like I said, what certainly rang a bell for you. And then I started to see that as well. It's like this kind of validates the whole idea of maybe your practice is or should be worth more than you think it is. So, recapping a little bit, our scenarios, scenario one, we've got an independent practice, but maybe no succession plan. You own the practice, but the hidden danger may not be private equity or corporate. It may be just absence of a plan. You may have some value in there, but you may not realize it unless you have that succession architecture, some type of timeline, and you need to have a realistic conversation with the partners about what that looks like. And then scenario two, private equity backed. It's complicated, but still may not be hopeless. You certainly need to get legal and financial advice. Some doctors are buying their practices back again, but you know, sometimes there's not that transparency to know what's going on, and which leads us to the third scenario, which is the corporate strategic. And so now the retirement that was maybe visible as an independent and somewhat visible as part of the private equity entity is now even less so now that the private equity's rolled up into the corporate strategic. And so you really need to get some transparency and advice for what's going on there, because you just don't know what's going to happen when it comes time to retire.
Yeah, in all of these, the $2 million figure never disappears. It doesn't even change if you look at it as numbers on a screen. The only thing that changes is the story behind that number. So in the first scenario, the partner's story, the practice owns the story because it owns the retirement. But the buyout plan may be the hitch in its get along, so to speak, as we say in Texas.
Okay.
Secondly, whose story is it? Well, it's the private equity's story. That's the retirement story that is true in that scenario. And the third one is the story is owned by corporate strategics. So, who owns your story? This is not evidence that independent practice is over. It has, in fact, revealed that perhaps your independent practice has significant and durable value. The question is, are you still the one who's going to benefit from it? So, back to the beginning, the retirement is the practice and the equity is the plan. And everything we just walked through is the story of what happens if the scenarios change, or worse, are left to happenstance, or even worse, are delegated to someone else. So the practice has built something of value. McKesson just proved that. The question is, they'll pay that much to own your practice indefinitely. Shouldn't that tell you your practice might be well worth owning yourself? And now, as an independent practice, as a listener who has an independent practice, will that color your thinking? So, Peter, which of these three discussion scenarios really kind of informed you the most and switched your thinking the most about what you thought was a topic that was well understood or somewhat understood, and then, of course, the new information as well?
Well, really the third scenario, because obviously, first I'm familiar with, the second somewhat familiar with because I've seen it, but really didn't know what was going on with that third. And like I said, one could look at that and say, well, these are even big players. This is more alarming and a bigger threat. And there's a lot of talk, if you're a small practice and you don't have multiple locations, they may not even be interested. I don't know if that's true or not, but still, there may be a lot of anxiety about, are we going to get rolled up? But it seems to be like they're acquiring these packages of multiple practices and not necessarily going out and scooping up individual practices. But again, the whole narrative that if they're willing to spend so much money cash for these practices that they're going to keep indefinitely, then that was just eye-opening, because that means that you probably do have some value in your practice, and it may be untapped or not really fully realized to its potential. But hopefully that's something that we can help with. Some nice segue to our community here. But yeah, that was the eye-opening part, I think.
Okay, then, yeah, I kind of want to wrap up with, we always sound like we're harping on independent practices, but those are our darlings.
That's our thing.
Yeah, it is. The value being bigger and better than you might think it is, to me, was a fun thing to share with all of you today.
Yeah. And so I think with some of your research, you put that together in a report that we can
Yeah, I haven't
do?
finalized it, but I'm going to have the report available for download. I'm not going to vouch for all of the numbers because I did have AI help me construct the pro forma, but it looked understandable to me about what might be a scenario for the way things happen internally when you lose control of everything.
Sure. Okay. We'll keep an eye out for that. And again, we kind of come full circle because, as we said, independent practices is our thing, and our platform is about trying to keep independent practices practicing independently and from the perspective of AI augmented marketing. And that's where the whole Visionary Marketing Lab community came from.
Excellent. Well, I enjoyed researching it, and I didn't have the aha moments you did because of your deeper knowledge about what goes on in the other practices all around and colleagues you know. But it certainly did make me sit up and take notice.
Well, great. Thank you. And thanks for listening. And speaking of independent practices, if you are one, please join the community at visionarymarketinglab.com, where you'll have exclusive access to the latest in AI augmented marketing tools, apps, and automations, where our goal is to keep independent practices practicing independently.